Okay, good morning. This is Wednesday. It is the 10th, and if everybody could mute, that would be great. Somebody's not muted. Let's see. Okay, good. So I want to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about the exam. Make sure everybody knows what to expect. Okay, we'll finish up chapter 4 material also. Just a little bit of information I want to give you about alternatives to sugar, and then also how we compare different sweeteners and what some of the health effects are of the different added sugars. All right, so we'll go through that in a little bit. The exam went online today, and you have access to it until Friday at 11:59 p.m. Please don't take it until you have studied for it. Even though it is open note, you need to study for it as if it were not, because you won't have time to look up every answer. There are 45 questions. You have, I think, 70 minutes, 70, okay? And in terms of what it covers everything that we've gone over in class since the first day of lecture. So some of that introductory material that I gave you out of chapters 1 and 2, the definitions of a nutrient, definition of nutrition, an essential nutrient, the classes of nutrients. Make sure you know the 6 classes of nutrients. Make sure you know which nutrient is most abundant in the body. All of chapter 3 on digestion and absorption, all of chapter 4 on carbohydrates, including diabetes. Make sure you understand the difference between type 1 and type 2, just in terms of the cause. You're not going to be tested on treatment, but you will see a question on maybe some of the long-term consequences of diabetes, and just the ones that I went over in class, all right? And that wasn't an all-inclusive list. Let's see what else. The hormones that regulate glucose levels in the blood, make sure you know those 2 hormones. Do you remember what those are?
Insulin.
Insulin, and there are 2.
Glucagon?
Right, Madison, glucagon. Insulin and glucagon. A lot of students seem to get that question wrong. They just pick insulin and they forget the glucagon. But make sure you remember glucagon also. Let's see. Chapter 6, all of chapter 6 on proteins, including vegetarian diets, okay? Make sure you know the difference between a vegan diet, a lacto-vegetarian diet, and a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet, just in terms of the types of foods that are included in those diets, okay, in general. Let's see. Oh, also that little mini lecture that I gave you on calories. You will have to calculate calorie content of a food item, okay? There is a study guide on Canvas for you. I think it would be a really good idea if you downloaded it and wrote out the answers to those questions. The study guide, it's just a bunch of open-ended questions. You know, what is a nutrient? What is an essential nutrient? What are the classes of nutrients? Okay, that kind of thing. And if you write out the answers to those questions, you pretty much have 75% of the exam covered right there, or more. The exam requires you to use Chrome as your browser and to have installed Proctorio. Proctorio is a Chrome extension that will lock down your browser. I've seen some criticisms of this online, criticisms about my class and my use of Proctorio. It's not invasive. It doesn't invade your privacy at all. I'm not requiring a camera. All it does is it limits what you can do with your computer when you are taking the exam. That's all. It's just an attempt to deter cheating. I've had a lot of cheating in the last few years with online quizzes and online exams. And so it's just one measure that I'm taking to try and deter that. If you haven't installed Proctorio yet, I have an announcement that you can go look at that gives you the link to install it. Or when you go to take the practice exam, it will prompt you to install Proctorio then. And I would highly recommend that you try the practice exam first. It's just to make sure you have your computer set up properly. It's really not for study purposes at all, to test your knowledge at all. It's just to make sure that you have the computer set up properly. When you go to take the exam, if you are prompted for an access code, you haven't set up your computer properly. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, questions about the exam? I'm guessing everybody understands what is expected then. All right. So yesterday, any questions about the study guide? How about we do that first? Any questions about the study guide? All right. Yesterday, I had a student ask about the calculation questions on the exam. And so I went over those with the Tuesday, Thursday class. I thought maybe I'd go over it with you. There are two calculation questions on the exam. The first one is to calculate somebody's protein requirement. Do you remember how to do that? You need to know the RDA for protein.
I think the first part was to convert the body weight in pounds to kilograms. And I think you did that by dividing by 2.2 or something.
Yeah, that's great, Rachel. But you know what? I'm going to make it super easy for you on the exam. I will give you the person's weight in kilograms, but you're absolutely right. You need to know weight in kilograms, not in pounds, but I'll give you that. So now what is the RDA for protein?
0.8 point.
0.8.
0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, right? 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. So here we go. This is how you do it. Can you see that? So the DRI for protein, you need to know that. I'm not going to give you that on the exam. So you will need to know this, all right? You need to memorize this number here, 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. And then you take the person's weight in kilograms. And this is an example I just came up with yesterday. A woman weighs 60 kilograms, just to make it the calculation easy. Question is, what is her protein requirement? You take the RDA, 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, multiply it by her body weight. When you do that, the kilograms cancel out and you're left with grams per day, 48 grams per day. So any questions about that calculation? All right, and then the other calculation that you'll need to do is to calculate calories in a food item. I will give you grams of protein, grams of carbohydrate, and grams of fat. And the question will be, how many calories in this food item, okay? And then you just need to multiply the grams of protein times 4 kilocalories per gram, grams of carbohydrate by 4, and grams of fat by 9. And then you add those three numbers together, okay? And you get the total. Does anybody need me to go over a specific example? Right. Let's go to this. So I wanted to give you a little bit more information because I think that there's bad information out there. If you're looking online about sugar or carbohydrates in the diet and health risks associated with them, you're going to get a lot of wrong information, and I want to make sure you have the right information. Okay, coming out of a Nutrition 300 class, you should know what the correct information is. So if we look at sugar intake, and I want to remind you that when we talk about sugar intake, we really need to differentiate between natural sugar that might be in fruit or dairy, right, and added sugar. And really, the focus should be on limiting our intake of added sugar. So what are some added sugars? Sugars that are added to foods.
Corn syrup.
Okay, usually it's high fructose corn syrup. Yeah, that's one. High fructose corn syrup. What's another added sugar?
Cane sugar.
Cane sugar or just sugar. Some food companies get kind of creative and they might call it cane juice or dehydrated cane juice. And don't get confused by that. That's just sugar. All right, sugar. And the granulated sugar that you buy could either come from grains, or not grains, cane, right? Sugar cane, or it could come from sugar beets. What's another added sugar? Maybe not in processed foods, but maybe added sugar that you use at home.
Honey.
Yep, honey. That would fall under the classification of added sugar, absolutely. Can you think of any others?
Would molasses count as one?
Yeah, some people
Or is
might.
that just syrup?
Some people might like molasses. Molasses is, I don't know if you've ever had it. It has a really strong flavor. But yeah, molasses would be an added sugar. So Karen said stevia. Stevia is not a sugar, and I will talk about stevia. Stevia is an alternative to sugar, but if stevia is put in a food product, it's not a carbohydrate, it's not a sugar. It's a sweetener, but it's not a sugar. And then artificial sweeteners, those aren't sugars, right? That's a completely different classification. So added sugars, just to keep us moving along, would be sugar, just sugar, right? Could be brown sugar. I don't know if you ever use brown sugar. It's definitely an added sugar. Some people like to put it on their hot cereal, right? High fructose corn syrup, that's frequently used by food companies. It's an added sugar. Honey is an added sugar. If you happen to use molasses, absolutely. Agave, I don't know if any of you use agave. That would be an added sugar, okay? So really the recommendation is to limit our intake of added sugars. But here's the thing. There's no real cause and effect. There haven't been any studies to show that if you eat a lot of added sugar, you will get diabetes. Okay, that connection definitely not there. It's not there. Or if you eat a lot of sugar, you will get heart disease. That connection is not there at all. When we look at the effects of high blood glucose, right, over a long period of time, what we see is that there's greater inflammation. So when somebody has high blood glucose, it creates an inflammatory condition inside the body. And we know that inflammation is linked to development of heart disease. Okay. And so that's kind of where this recommendation for limiting added sugars comes from. Okay. But there's still nothing to say if you eat a lot of sugar, you will get heart disease. Okay. So let's try and keep that clear. There's a correlation, but it's not cause and effect. All right. Now, a lot of the bad information that you can find about high fructose corn syrup has come from studies where humans were fed fructose. So just fructose, all right? And what we see when people are fed fructose, and these are highly controlled studies, usually inpatient studies where everything is tightly monitored, that when people are fed fructose, there's an elevation in blood lipids, suggesting that fructose is more easily converted to fat. And that causes an elevation in blood lipids as compared to when people are fed pure glucose. Okay. It's because of these fructose feeding studies that high fructose corn syrup got a bad name, got a bad reputation. And that's why everybody is off of high fructose corn syrup. And the public is pressuring food companies to get the high fructose corn syrup out of their foods, okay? And if we look at high fructose corn syrup consumption over the last 30 years, it's consistently gone up. And what else has gone up? Obesity rates have gone up, and the graphs practically mirror each other. And heart disease rates have gone up, okay? But to say it's because of high fructose corn syrup is faulty logic, all right? Because the same thing probably would have happened if food companies just put sugar in their foods. So what I wanted to do is show you sort of a comparison, the composition of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, honey, and agave, and talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted to do. I need to keep sharing, but I need to go to a different screen. So let's go back to this screen. Okay. So what I want to look at is I want to look at the glucose to fructose ratio for sugar, high fructose corn syrup, honey, and agave. Okay. So let's start with sugar. What is the glucose to fructose ratio for sugar or sucrose? Glucose to fructose ratio. What is sucrose? Let's start there. Chemically, what is sucrose?
Isn't it a disaccharide?
Okay, it's a disaccharide made up of what two, di means two, what two monosaccharides?
Is it glucose and galactose?
No, that's lactose.
Fructose and glucose.
Okay, glucose and fructose, right? And what's the ratio?
1-to-1.
1-to-1, right? So half of sucrose is glucose, half of sucrose is fructose, right? So let's say it's 50-50. Why is this not? Let's go here. 50-50, right? 50% glucose, 50% fructose. right? Okay, let's take a look at high fructose corn syrup. Now, food companies have different formulations of high fructose corn syrup that they can buy with different ratios, okay? But commonly, yeah, it's 45 to 55. So 45% of high fructose corn syrup is glucose, 55% is fructose. Now, honey, why would people use honey? What's some of the reasons why somebody might use honey?
Natural.
It's natural, right? It's not processed, okay? Honey, glucose to fructose ratio, approximately 45 to 55. If we look at the chemical composition of honey and high fructose corn syrup, they're very similar. But nobody says don't use honey because it's not healthy for you, right? Okay, how about agave? Anybody use agave? I actually like agave for like cold drinks, like iced tea, or when I make cocktails, I like agave because it mixes in more easily. Why do you think people might use agave? Or if any of you prefer agave, why do you think you might prefer agave?
Less glucose.
Oh, do you already know that?
I'm just thinking for the solubility part, it would be less glucose, more fructose.
Well, I don't know if that really affects solubility, but a lot of people like agave because it's natural, right? And so the glucose to fructose ratios of all of these, and I'm going to put a approximate symbol there because these are not exact, but they're approximate. But it gives you an idea of how these compare to each other, right? So when we're looking at the type of sweetener that's used, and we're trying to discuss if one is healthier than the other, they're all very similar in terms of chemical composition. And I will tell you that your body can't differentiate glucose coming from sucrose or high fructose corn syrup or honey or agave, right? Now, what would have been more interesting to look at, instead of feeding people fructose versus glucose and seeing what happens physiologically, is let's feed people sucrose, right? Sugar, versus high fructose corn syrup and see if there's any difference physiologically. And the fact is, there isn't, right? There isn't. So to say that high fructose corn syrup is the worst option in terms of sweeteners used, I think is faulty. Now, there may be a benefit to using high fructose corn syrup or honey or agave based on these ratios. So let me give you this information. Fructose is sweeter than glucose. So how might that translate to a health benefit?
Use less
You might
because
use
it's sweeter.
You might use less, yeah. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but honey is a lot sweeter than just plain sugar, right? So if you use less added sugar, fewer calories, right, than sugar. So there is a slight benefit maybe from that standpoint, but in terms of what's happening to blood glucose levels or to, actually, I'm gonna say ignore that. What's happening in terms of blood lipids is not significantly different. Now, fructose may not raise blood glucose levels to the same extent, right? So honey might raise blood glucose levels to a lesser degree than sugar because of the higher fructose. Okay, so that could be a benefit for somebody, but probably not a significant benefit. Okay. So
Is there any sort of, oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
Is there any sort of nutritional benefit to things like honey and agave that are more natural besides the glucose and the fructose?
Yeah, so I don't really know anything about agave in terms of that, but with honey, if you're talking about raw honey that hasn't been pasteurized, right, or filtered, if you're talking about raw honey, I would say that there could be some health benefits. There are some nutrients that might be in the honey. Also, if you have seasonal allergies, consuming local raw honey may help you because you're giving your body some of those allergens, so it might help you in terms of boosting your immune system against those airborne allergens. You know, so honey is kind of an interesting substance, right? It's been used for millennia, really, as a food to treat wounds, right? So I would say there could be some slight advantages to honey from a nutritional standpoint, but it would have to be raw honey that hasn't been processed.
Okay, thank you.
And if you're buying it at the grocery store, it's not like that. Okay, let's go back to this, and not that, but here. So that takes care of fructose and high fructose corn syrup. Processed carbohydrates, these are grains that have been processed, and like all of the fiber has been stripped from the grain, and only the endosperm part of the grain has been processed. So things like white rice, white flour, anything made from white flour, okay? There is some suggestion that consumption of processed carbohydrates can create inflammation in the body as well. And probably one of the worst pieces of nutrition advice over the last 40, 50 years has been to eat low fat. And when nutritionists, health professionals started telling the public to eat low fat, they had to replace the fat in their diet with something. They replaced the fat in their diet with carbohydrate. So fat intake went down, carbohydrate intake went up, processed carbohydrate intake went up, obesity rates went up, heart disease rates went up. And a lot of that has to do with that inflammation, you know, the inflammatory process in the body that leads to atherosclerosis. So when we're looking at grain products in the diet, there should be an emphasis on whole grains. And it's not that every carbohydrate grain product you consume is a whole grain, but at least half of your grain intake should be whole. So instead of white rice, brown rice, instead of white bread, whole wheat bread, instead of white flour tortillas, whole wheat flour tortillas or corn tortillas, you know, things like that. Just trying to focus more on the whole grains, and that will reduce some of the health risks associated with that. And I want to say that all of this information is really based on epidemiological studies, right? So studies of populations, not necessarily placebo-controlled human studies, okay? In terms of high sugar intake, no relationship between high intake of sugar and diabetes. When I was a kid, my grandparents, my parents always said, if you eat too much sugar, you're going to get diabetes. And we know for a fact that that's not the case. No real cause and effect of high sugar intake, with the exception of maybe from a substitution of calorie standpoint, you might end up with some long-term nutritional deficiencies. Okay, if you're eating a lot of sugar, getting a lot of your calories from sugar, you're probably not eating fruits and vegetables, whole grains, dairy, legumes, and so probably not getting all of your nutritional needs met. And then dentists will tell you that high intake of sugar can lead to dental caries or cavities. And definitely, I think that's possible, but I also think that oral hygiene probably plays a role as well. And so here's a nice picture to scare you into flossing your teeth and brushing your teeth. So these are dental caries or cavities. And when the teeth are decayed like this, there's going to be a lot of pain associated with it. Certain foods will not be tolerated because it'll cause too much pain. So anyway, that can further impact your nutritional status. All right. Any questions on anything so far? I'm not going to go over the information on this slide. This is just a reminder that you need to know the health benefits of fiber, both soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. And some of the health benefits we talked about were in terms of weight control or weight management, right? Weight loss. So make sure you are aware of how diets high in fiber can help with that. We talked about soluble fiber and decreasing your risk for heart disease. With diabetes, it would be good if you could remember how fiber can help with management of blood glucose levels. With cancer, the focus here was on colon cancer, so you should probably be familiar with how diets high in fiber can decrease your risk for colon cancer. And then we also talked about just general GI health, things like decreasing risk for constipation, decreasing risk for hemorrhoids, decreasing risk for diverticulitis. Okay, because you might see a couple of questions on the exam regarding that. So is there anything here that you're unclear about? Right. Just some general recommendations for carbohydrates or sugars. The RDA for carbohydrates, for total carbohydrates, is 130 grams per day. At 130 grams per day, you will be able to avoid ketosis and store glycogen. Now, most of you are probably consuming more than 130 grams of carbohydrate per day. For fiber, recommendation for women is 25 grams per day, and for men, 38 grams per day. And if you're not eating fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes, you're probably having a difficult time meeting this requirement. On your iProfile report, one of the things I like you to look at is your fiber intake. So you can go back to that and take a look at it. And then if it's below the requirement, start thinking of foods that you could include in your diet or substitute for foods that you're currently eating that would increase your fiber intake. When we look at an overall diet and we're trying to determine how well balanced that diet is, we often first look at what percent of the calories come from protein, from carbohydrate, and from fat. And there are very specific recommendation ranges for each of those. And your iProfile report called macronutrient distribution tells you what your distribution of calories was over those 3 days. This is what we aim for with carbohydrate. We aim for 45 to 65% of our calories from carbohydrates. Okay. So that tells us that, at least in terms of carbohydrates, the diet is well balanced. And then the American Heart Association has recommendations for added sugar. Maximum amount of added sugar for women is 6 teaspoons per day or 100 calories. And for men, 9 teaspoons per day or 150 calories. Sometimes you'll see the recommendation less than 10% of your calories from added sugar. That recommendation has been lowered. So American Heart Association puts it in terms of calories or teaspoons, and this is to lower your risk for heart disease. And that's because high sugar intake equates to high blood glucose levels, at least sporadically, and that may increase inflammation in the body. If you try and put this in perspective of maybe a particular food item, this would be, for women, less than 1 regular soda a day, right? So if you drink regular soda, not diet, but regular, that would be a limit of less than 1 12-ounce can per day. So that doesn't give you much for putting sugar in coffee or having some type of a sweet, like a cake, a cookie, or candy. So the added, and also it doesn't consider any, or gives you any allowance for added sugars in processed foods, other processed foods. So these recommendations are actually pretty stringent. Any questions about that?
Nope.
Let's take a look at alternatives to sugar. I want to talk about 3, and then I'll talk about stevia, but I want to talk about these 3 main ones first. Do any of you use alternatives to sugar or drink diet soda or any other type of diet beverage that might use? You do? What do you drink?
Aspartame, like Pepsi Zero.
Okay, and it has aspartame in it. Okay. Anybody else use any of these in your coffee or tea? Okay. So I always, I need to put these in a different order because I always want to start with saccharin. So saccharin was kind of the first alternative to sugar that gained wide use here in the United States. And it was the first alternative to sugar that was in most diet soft drinks. So back in the early 1970s, right? Saccharin, heat stable. What that means is you can cook with it, all right? Has a pretty long shelf life. Now, when saccharin first came out, there was another alternative to sugar called cyclamate. And researchers started feeding saccharin and cyclamate to laboratory animals to see how safe they were. And what happened was that research showed that both saccharin and cyclamate caused cancer in laboratory animals. The research kind of came out at different times here and in Canada. And in Canada, they banned saccharin and kept cyclamate because of the cancer-causing potential. But when the United States saw the information on cyclamate, they banned cyclamates, and then the research on saccharin came out, and the US couldn't ban saccharin also because these were the only alternatives to sugar for people with diabetes. So US kept saccharin, banned cyclamate. Canada banned saccharin, kept cyclamate. If you take a look at the research and the amounts of each of these alternatives to sugar that were fed to the animals, human intake would never reach those levels. And so to translate that research to humans is probably faulty. So no research in humans has shown that saccharin has any negative health effects at all. Okay. I don't know if you guys have tried saccharin. I think it has a bit of a artificial flavor, right? I don't particularly like it. In the mid 1980s, aspartame came out. Aspartame is in the little blue packets at the coffee bar. Aspartame goes by the trade name NutraSweet or Equal. And when aspartame came out, it was definitely preferred over saccharin because it tasted a little bit more like sugar, a little less artificial. Aspartame is a dipeptide. Does anybody remember what a dipeptide is? Dipeptide.
Isn't it amino acids that are linked together through 2 peptide bonds?
One peptide.
One
bond.
peptide.
So 2 amino acids, that's the di, 1 peptide bond. So it's 2 amino acids, it's just a dipeptide. And it's a dipeptide of aspartate and phenylalanine. Aspartate and phenylalanine. So technically, the body deals with it like it's a protein, right? Your body can't differentiate where this dipeptide came from, whether it came from aspartame or came from dairy or came from beef or chicken or anything, right? It's just 2 amino acids hooked together. So you're going to digest it like it's a protein, right? So you're going to break those amino acids apart. You're going to absorb those individual amino acids. That's it. So technically, aspartame has calories. Technically, it gives us energy. But because those 2 amino acids linked together happen to be so much sweeter than sugar, you use such a small amount to get the sweetness that you want. The calorie content is negligible, right? But if you consumed a lot of it, you would technically get some calories from it. The problem with aspartame or NutraSweet is that it loses its sweetness with heat. So you can't cook with it. You can't bake cakes or candies or cookies, pies with it because it loses its sweetness with heat. All right. If you did a research on aspartame or NutraSweet, you would probably come up with a lot of online articles that tell you that aspartame is terrible for you. It causes cancer. It causes seizure activity. There's no research to support that whatsoever. All right. No research to support that. So it's definitely safe. The next alternative to sugar that came out was sucralose. This goes by the brand name Splenda, and this is in the little yellow packets at the coffee bar. Sucralose came out 2004, 2005, something like that. I remember I was teaching at Cal Poly at the time, so sometime within that 2003 to 2005 time range. Sucralose, interestingly, is made from sugar. It's made from sucrose. Slight modification to the sucrose molecule that prevents it from being digested and absorbed. None of these, by the way, affect blood sugar levels. All 3 of these are safe for people with diabetes because they don't affect blood sugar levels. Because of the modification to the sucrose molecule making sucralose, we don't digest it, we don't absorb it, no calories from it, okay? The great thing about sucralose is that it is heat stable, so you can cook with it. If you go down the sugar aisle in the grocery store, you'll find bags of Splenda, and then you'll also find sort of, I think they call it a baking blend. It's basically half Splenda, half sugar. So if you wanted to cut the sugar content of a cake or cookie or a pie, anything that you're baking, you could easily do that. Now, do any of you have experience with these three other than diet soda? Have any of you tried all three of them? So I personally think they each taste artificial. I mean, definitely there's some sweetness on the palate, but I think they taste like a chemical artificial. That's my personal take on it.
They kind of reminded me of, I think maybe I've only tried aspartame and either saccharin or sucralose, not all three.
Mhm.
But they kind of reminds me of stevia, the way it tastes sweet, but not in the same way.
Right. And actually, I was going to talk about stevia next. So stevia, a lot of people prefer this because it's natural. Stevia, you can grow stevia in your garden, right? It's an herb. And it just happens to have a chemical in it. This is the chemical structure that causes the sweet taste on your tongue. It's not a carbohydrate, right? So you're not going to digest it. You're not going to get calories from it. It's not going to affect blood glucose levels. Definitely safe for people with diabetes. You can grow this in your garden, take a leaf, put it in your hot tea, and it will sweeten your hot tea. So a lot of people prefer this one because it's natural, but I also think it has sort of a chemical flavor, right? It doesn't taste exactly like sugar. I think all four of those taste about the same, sort of an artificial flavor, an artificial sweetness, right? So those are the four alternatives to sugar that I wanted you to know about. Do you guys have any questions at all? I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to stop recording, okay?